Peasant Revolution in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, 1975 to 1991, by John Young. Chapter 1, Peasants and Revolutions, Theoretical Directions. Introduction. In 1974, a popular movement brought down the faltering old regime of Emperor Haile Selassie, but it was a military cabal, the Derg, which assumed state power. Unwilling to share power with civilians or acknowledge the right of Ethiopia's nations to self-determination, the Derg was challenged on many fronts, from a reinvigorated secessionist movement in Eritrea, student radicals in the urban centers of Ethiopia, and a host of rural-based national insurgencies. In these chaotic conditions, a small group of university students launched a national liberation struggle in early 1975 from the desperately poor province of Tigray. With approximately 3.1 million people, Tigray possesses about 5% of Ethiopia's population, has no industrial base or valuable exports, and its overwhelming population of peasants had the highest percentage of landholders in imperial Ethiopia. In spite of the TPLF's inauspicious and largely ignored entrance onto the revolutionary stage, with the overwhelming support of the province's peasants, the movement captured Tigray in 1989 and went on to lead a coalition of ethnic-based movements that assumed state power in 1991. With this turn of events, it has become ever more pressing to develop an understanding of the basis and course of the Tigrayan revolution and the means by which the front mobilized the peasantry of the province. These are the main objectives to which this study is directed, but to approach them there is a need for theoretical direction in approaching the problem of revolution. The study of revolution began in ancient times, but the approach has changed from an interest in the normative aspects of the revolution to the conspiratorial approach popularized by Machiavelli in the Middle Ages, to present concerns with understanding the causes of revolutions. Until recently, non-structuralist accounts of revolution, which assumed conditions of value consensus and state legitimacy, and largely ignored the fact that most post-1945 revolutions were rural-focused, dominated the academic literature. The result was theories grounded in the examination of natural history, psychology, and politics. In contrast, a school of theorizing that can be called the Peasant Revolt thesis took form. Largely championed by American scholars in the 1970s, it was influenced by and was a response to the trauma of the Vietnam War. Common to followers of this school, which for the purpose of this study can be identified as Eric Wolf, Joel Migdal, Jeffrey Page, and James Scott, is first a structural approach that assumes a conflictual model of society. Secondly, an emphasis on the devastating impact of the incorporation of agrarian societies into the world economy. And lastly, a focus which gives central place to the role of the peasantry and criticizes the classical Marxian contention that the urban proletariat spearheads revolutionary struggles. Exponents of the Peasant Revolt thesis have played a valuable role in bringing attention to the critical part performed by peasants in revolutions in the modern era. This contribution has been particularly estimable because it was pursued at a time when behavioralists largely ignored peasants and Marxists saw them as at best assuming a supportive role to the proletariat in revolution. John Young will proceed to examine these approaches taken by these theorists in 3 areas. First, the relation drawn between peasant class and revolution. Secondly, the linkage between agricultural commercialization and revolution. And lastly, the significance attached to factors or forces outside the peasantry in explaining revolution. The chapter ends with an argument based on the experience of Tigray for widening the explanatory framework to include non-structural factors, notably regime stimulus to revolt, nationalism, and the political leadership of the Revolutionary Party. Peasant classes and revolution. The theorists examined here vary considerably in their approach, with Eric Wolf and Page holding class relations to be critical, Migdal denying their significance, and Scott concluding that attempts to link class to proclivity to revolution only produce ambiguous conclusions. When peasant classes are identified as assuming dominant roles in the revolution, categorically different conclusions are reached, with Wolf pointing to middle peasants, Page to sharecroppers, and Scott to subsistence peasants. Wolf finds that the middle peasant, or peasantries on the periphery, constitute the major force behind rebellions, while poor peasants, or landless laborers who go to the city, usually break their tie to the land. Middle peasants stay on the land, but typically send their children to the towns to find work or go to school. In the process, they are the most exposed to influences from the developing proletariat and become transmitters of urban unrest and political ideas to fellow villagers. In Wolff's understanding, so the peasant has some degree of tactical mobility, which grants them freedom from constraints of the landlord market or state. And in John Young's perspective, the paradox is that the middle peasants find it difficult to maintain their traditional way of life, that they become revolutionary. Unlike Wolff, Migdal does not find a linkage between peasant class and revolutionary potential. Instead, he focuses on peasant-landlord relationships and makes a distinction between communities where landlords govern the activities of peasants, usually feudal states or patrimonial domains, and those communities where there were no landlords or their power was limited, typically freeholding villages in bureaucratic states or marginal lands beyond the lord's control. In the first case, the lord restricted peasant orientation outwards because it posed a threat to his monopoly of power, while in the second case, peasants developed institutions and prohibitions to minimize their outside contact and market participation to protect their way of life. Migdal then places the outward-oriented peasant between the powerful lord on the one hand and the restrictions of the corporate community on the other, where there is somewhat unequal distribution of powers. This finding follows Wolff, who focuses on tactically mobile peasants, and Migdal's later hypothesis that revolutionary situations are more likely to emerge in areas of poor administration, communication, and transportation is also similar to that made by Wolff. Page, in turn, bases his analysis of peasant revolution on class and holds that revolutions are shaped by the relationship between upper and lower classes in rural areas undergoing agricultural commercialization. From this perspective, he proposes a series of hypotheses predictive of rural class conflict that broadly follow Marx's premise that immiserization provided the stimulus for working class revolution and applied it to the agricultural worker. Page's hypotheses can be summarized. First, a combination of both non-cultivators and cultivators dependent upon land as their principal sources of income leads to agrarian revolt directed at the redistribution of landed property and usually lacks broader political objectives. Second, a combination of non-cultivators dependent upon income from commercial capital and cultivators dependent upon their land will result in a reform commodity movement. Page's third hypothesis is that a combination of non-cultivators dependent on income from capital and cultivators dependent on income from wages leads to a reform labor movement concerned with limited economic demands. Fourth, Page holds that a combination of non-cultivators dependent upon income from land and cultivators dependent on income from wages leads to revolution. In this latter case, wage-dependent and land-poor peasants are pitted against landlords tied to traditional means of labor exploitation who cannot give up more of the agricultural product without reducing their own share of surplus, and with reformist solutions impossible, revolution results. Page's analysis is at odds with that of Wolff, as can be seen in their respective approaches to the social basis of the Vietnamese Revolution. Wolff finds revolutionary potential among the middle peasantry and ethnic minorities in the northern and central regions of the country, who had some access to land and who maintained a strong sense of village solidarity. The revolt of these peasants, he maintains, was largely a defensive response to the impact of commercialization, and they were able to revolt because of their tactical mobility. Peasants thus become revolutionary to prevent proletarianization. Conversely, Page locates the core of the Vietnamese Revolution among the export-oriented Mekong Delta rice sharecroppers who, unlike the traditional smallholder peasants, had little prospect of social mobility, were not motivated by individualism, and hence were more receptive to radical political and social doctrines. Wolff's revolutionary land-holding middle peasantry are, for Page, traditional, conservative, and non-revolutionary. Peasants in Page's schemata become revolutionary because of proletarianization. For James Scott, subsistence peasants are more likely to be revolutionary because they are most vulnerable to the landlord. However, he finds that the answer to the problem of relating revolution to peasant social structure to be ambiguous because in comparing peasantries with strong communal traditions and few sharp internal class divisions, with peasantries with weak communal traditions and sharp class divisions, diametrically opposite conclusions can be drawn. First, a more undifferentiated peasantry will experience economic shocks in a uniform manner. But in a more variegated class structure, the different strata will experience and respond to them differently. Second, communitarian structures foster traditional solidarity and hence a greater capacity for collective action. Scott finds that very different conclusions can be logically drawn from the same case. Differentiated communities are likely where commercial forces are strongest, and while their responses to these disturbances may be more problematic, their greater exposure may make them more explosive. Moreover, while communal structures facilitate collective action, at the same time, they are better arranged to redistribute pain and thus avoid or postpone subsistence crises. The fundamental difficulty of the peasant revolt theorists' approach to peasant classes is that it is largely inapplicable to the agrarian social structure in Tigray. Highland Tigray, on the eve of the overthrow of the old regime, had very little genuine capitalist farming. Moreover, those who assumed the role of landlords were often poor peasants who did not have the necessary oxen to plow their land and were forced to rent it to rich peasants who had oxen. As a result, wealth was normally defined in terms of possession of capital, largely in the form of oxen and other animals, and not land. In addition, Scott's identification of subsistence tenant farmers and Page's singling out of sharecroppers can have little explanatory relevance in Tigrayan contexts. While there are indications that in the final years of the old regime, severe land shortages were developing, it had not progressed far in large part because the traditional system of tenure made the alienation of land and its accumulation by the state, landlords, and capitalists extremely difficult. For a number of reasons, defining class in Tigray is problematic. First, although ruling families became a feature of the society, titles were generally not inheritable, and therefore class consolidation through inheritance was discouraged. Secondly, peasant-held land was never completely secure, and as land shortages developed in the second half of this century, peasants increasingly resorted to the courts to sort out claims, and this led to plots of land frequently changing hands. Thirdly, defining peasant class in the Tigrayan context is made difficult by the need to account for considerable regional differences in wealth and climatic conditions, which could produce significant changes in household income from one year to the next. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly, social structural flux was caused by the dislocation Tigrayans have experienced in the past 100 years as a result of war, drought, environmental decline, and pestilence. Wolff's understanding of the importance of peasants on the periphery in revolution and Migdol's finding that revolutionary situations commonly emerge in areas of poor administration, communication, and transportation are relevant but in need of revision. As a result of state centralization by Amhara elites from the central Ethiopian province of Shoa between the late 19th century and the 1974 collapse of the old regime, Tigray had become a peripheralized, underdeveloped region. Thus, the province was well placed to challenge state hegemony, and its weakly administered lowlands in the west and south central part of the province became early centers of the TPLF-led revolt. However, the evidence from Tigray does not support Wolff's finding that middle or peripheral peasantries play a dominant role in revolution because of their tactical mobility. Indeed, Wolff misses the point. It is the revolutionaries' interaction with such peasants that their location permits that is of importance, not isolation per se. Peasant support for the insurrection was by no means restricted to peripheral parts of Tigray, but relative inaccessibility from the organs of the state attracted revolutionaries, and it was this characteristic which linked the otherwise disparate woredas that became early TPLF strongholds. TPLF officials reported that most rich peasants were or became strong supporters of the struggle, and there is some indication that the reason why this was the case are similar to those Wolff gave for the middle peasant support for rebellion. That is, they were less subject to societal constraints and had stronger links with the town, the source of the revolutionary stimulus. Rich peasants in Tigray were also more likely than middle or poor peasants to have children employed as teachers or in attendance at high school or university, the breeding ground of early TPLF revolutionaries. As a result, it is not possible to relate peasant wealth to proclivity to revolt in Tigray. Agricultural commercialization. Peasant revolt theorists contend that peasants revolt to maintain old ways when traditional institutions and relationships are upended or made ineffective by agricultural commercialization. Wolff holds that peasant rebellion unfolds in the context of a large-scale cultural encounter between capitalist and pre-capitalist societies, which results in the breakdown of custom, the ending of social obligations between rulers and ruled, and the creation of wage labor and a market in land. Page does not analyze in detail the impact of imperialism on pre-capitalist societies, but his studies take place in the context of the commercialization of agriculture, and he places particular emphasis on the social formations and class conflicts that commercialization gives rise to. Migdal also points to the impact of imperialist penetration in traditional economies, which unleashes such forces as population growth, patron withdrawal, new and increased taxes, and loss of income, all of which served to undermine the inward orientation of the peasantry and refocus their material existence. Scott follows Migdal in analyzing the impact of imperialism on pre-capitalist peasant societies, which transforms land and labor into commodities, brings about income differentiation, destroys subsidiary occupations, brings about demands for more rent by landowners and more taxes by the state, and causes the erosion of risk-sharing values of villages and kin groups. According to Scott, this process promotes tensions to a point where peasants have little alternative but to resist. Such an explanation, however, has limited application for Tigray. Apart from lowland areas on the periphery of Tigray, there was virtually no large-scale production of cash crops for export in the province, and at the time of the collapse of the old regime, a market in the peasants' land was only beginning to emerge. While peasants were increasingly taking up seasonal wage labor on farms, usually outside Tigray, few of them were landless and thus did not constitute a rural proletariat. Patron-client relations were not dissolved as a result of agricultural commercialization because the dominant elements in this process were from the nobility who served as patrons. Agricultural commercialization alternatively refers to imperialism or capitalism, neither of which figured prominently in Tigray. Foreign capital, largely in the form of aid but also as investment, was beginning to have a marked impact in parts of Ethiopia at the time of the overthrow of the old regime. But in the small landholder-dominated economy of Tigray, there was little investment of commercial nature. This pattern of agricultural commercialization is also at odds with Marx's contention that the interests of industrial and commercial capitalists were incompatible with those of feudal landowners. Instead, Tigrayan experience supports the views of Moore, who recognized that agrarian capitalism could emerge from within the traditional landowning classes. The expansion of commercial agriculture in the highlands, where most Tigrayan peasants lived, was also limited by traditional systems of land tenure, which made land alienation extremely difficult, and by the poor quality of the soils, which precluded the production of plantation cash crops. Indeed, both the ecological insecurity of the Ethiopian highlands and the relative security of peasant land holdings under the traditional tenure system proved to be hindrances to the development of commercial agriculture, and at the same time served to distinguish conditions in Tigray from those in Southeast Asia, which served as the basis for the conclusions of the peasant revolt theorists. Agricultural commercialization thus did not have a markedly disrupted impact on indigenous systems of land tenure or on the rural economy in highland Tigray, and therefore cannot explain peasant support for revolution. There is no indication that Tigrayan peasants opposed agricultural commercialization, and good reason to suspect that taking up seasonal farming labor and selling small surpluses had become critical to their survival. This is the view of the TPLF leadership, who held that peasants' poverty was due to the lack of modern development in the province. In the face of rising population, declining plot size, failing soil fertility, and the increasing frequency of drought and famine in the 20th century, growing numbers of peasants looked to seasonal employment on commercial farms as a survival strategy. Unfortunately, the agricultural commercialization that was taking place in Tigray on the eve of the overthrow of the old regime was on too small a scale to produce the economic growth needed to reduce poverty or to meet the expanding demand for wage labor that the crisis in the rural economy was producing. The breakdown in patron-client relations came about as a result of government decree ending feudal obligations and to a lesser extent under the impact of the TPLF's rural political mobilization. It was not a product of agricultural commercialization. Economic relations in Tigray had not become bureaucratic and impersonal, which Wolff held was a necessary precondition to peasant revolt. Moreover, the conception of the breakup of the self-sufficient pre-capitalist village with its associated stable social relations and way of life under the onslaught of agricultural commercialization propounded by exponents of the peasant revolt thesis is both unduly romantic and untrue in the Tigrayan context. The TPLF was not taken with such fanciful conceptions of pre-capitalist agrarian life, and after initially pursuing restrictive economic policies in the areas under its administration, responded to peasant opposition and allowed the employment of labor, encouraged markets, did not interfere with trade, and at no time threatened the possession of agricultural capital. Indeed, the Derg's introduction of agricultural marketing corporations and the prohibition against hiring wage labor helped drive peasants into the arms of the TPLF. The Tigrayan experience reinforces the conclusions of Popkin, who found in his study of the Vietnamese Revolution that peasants do not rebel because of their desire to reinstate traditional institutions threatened by capitalism, but instead because of their opposition to feudalism. Popkin found that contrary to the views of those who held that patron-client relations resting on mutual obligations were the linchpin of the village, these ties were instead related to power and strategic interaction among individuals, and typically resented by peasants who found them restrictive. What this study adds to his finding is that peasant rebellion can also be fostered by the policies of state socialist regimes, such as that of the Derg, which attempt to restrict peasant involvement in the commercial economy.